Here's another orals ship handling question. So in this scenario, the vessel is required to turn round in confined waters. Okay, we were looking for you to describe methods used to carry this out and where and when each method would be appropriate. So the first example we'll use is the current coming from ahead. So if the current's coming from ahead, you should use turning short round technique. So turning short round is when you're going to swing the ship. If it's a conventional vessel, right-handed, then we're going to swing to starboard to take advantage of the transverse thrust when we come astern on the engine. So in our scenario, we're in a river that's getting more confined, so it's getting more constricted. If we can turn short round successfully, you should be able to turn the ship round within about 1.5 ship's lengths. So it's a very neat technique. The only thing you have to watch for is that you don't gain too much speed, either ahead or astern. So always try and keep the speed down to about 1/2 knot when you're making the turn. Use bottom track on your speed log and just take your time, but don't use all your air. So be careful that when you're making a maneuver, make sure you put the wheel hard over before you start using the engine, so you're actually getting the full turning motion created by the propeller wash. Don't be tempted just to give kicks ahead with the wheel amidships, because it doesn't do anything for you. Okay, so we're starting a scenario and we're facing into the current. The initial idea is that we'll start to head a little bit more towards the port side of the bank because that will give us slightly more space to turn. As we start to come closer to the bank, we put the wheel harder starboard and we come ahead dead slow on the engine. The ship will start to slew to starboard, leave the wheel over and leave the engine running ahead. Eventually, the ship will keep swinging to starboard, but the speed will start to build up. As the speed builds up, stop the engine, put the wheel amidships, and then come slow astern on the engine. The turn will continue because the transverse thrust will help the turn, and while the ship is moving ahead, the transverse thrust is at its maximum. As soon as the motion of the ship is stopped, the pivot point comes back to the middle, and when you start to come astern in actual motion rather than just the engine, then the pivot point will start to move aft. As you're moving aft, the ship will not be turning so quickly, the rate of turn will drop. So once the speed astern gets to about 1/2 knot, stop engines, put the wheel harder starboard, and then come slow ahead on the engine again. This will start to instigate the turn. The ship will turn quickly as the propeller wash impinges on the rudder, and keep going harder starboard until the forward motion reaches 1/2 knot. Once you've reached 1/2 knot, stop engines, wheel amidships, come slow astern on the engine. This process is repeated, but you'll tend to find at a certain point, because the current will be on the beam, the ship will actually not turn so much. You'll just be setting down a little bit with the current. But don't worry about this, persevere and keep recycling the same maneuver. So ahead, harder starboard. Once you gain 1/2 knot, stop engines, midships, come astern on the engine, and keep repeating this until you get all the way around. Depending on the strength of the current, you may need to come ahead 5 or 6 times, but if you're lucky, maybe only 3 or 4 times will be sufficient. But try to remember, don't get too excited when the heading is coming round and start just leaving the engine coming ahead, because you'll tend to set towards the port side bank. So try to remember to have your astern motions as well, so that when you've got the astern motions, it will keep the stern in the middle of the river. And eventually you will get all the way around, and then you'll be able to proceed once you're parallel to the bank. start to proceed outbound. If, however, the current is from astern, the best technique to turn round quickly and in the minimum amount of space is to snub on the anchor. So in this case, the current is now astern and we're proceeding along the river, but we want to turn round. So the most efficient method is to start to cant the ship a little bit to starboard. This is assuming we're a right-handed normal vessel. And then deploy the starboard anchor. The anchor only needs to go onto the bottom so that it starts to catch. You do not need to put out 5 or 6 shackles. You're only looking at putting out sufficient to touch the bottom and maybe half a shackle more. It's just so it catches the bottom. Once the anchor starts to catch on the bottom, wheel amidships, stop engines, and let the current do all the work. The current will gradually push you around. Don't worry if you drag anchor slightly. The bow will always be held more by the anchor and the stern will move freely. At a certain point you'll find that the current will accelerate the stern quite quickly. Don't panic about this. Just accept that the ship is now turning. You can now put the wheel hard to starboard and be ready for a kick ahead. Let the ship come round. If it's coming around nicely, just allow the ship to turn in the current. And when you get more than 90 degrees across the current, you can then give a kick ahead on the engine to take the weight off the cable. Allow the ship to continue to turn, giving occasional kicks if the weight becomes too much on the cable. The ship will eventually start to straighten up in the current. Once you start to get to be almost parallel to the riverbanks, you can start to come ahead a little more so that you can proceed to heave up the anchor. You get the anchor close underfoot, the anchor will come up nice and easily and you'll get it onto the forecastle without any trouble. Keep heaving and keep coming ahead gently with the wheel hard to starboard. Once the anchor's up, you can increase speed and start proceeding along the river. That's the end of the maneuver.